Hello, and welcome to Across the World, a very brief introduction to some detective stories right before, during, and immediately after the Golden Age. As you know, in getting to know the style of and influences on detective fiction, Golden Age detective fiction, we've been primarily focused on European work, particularly British work. Across the world, translated British texts have often been, pretty much always been, the most popular Golden Age detective fiction in any region. In many cases, at least for a period of time, these translations of British texts were the first and only detective fiction available. That's what people were reading if they were reading detective fiction. The Brits, with some help from the Americans, created and popularized this style. So it made sense to focus first on that region. But the Golden Age didn't stop there. In this video, we're going to learn just a tiny bit. We only have time for a tiny bit of context for the text we're reading this week, all of which adhere to many traits of Golden Age style, even if they were not published precisely during that period, and though they were definitely colored by their particular cultures. They're very much from their particular cultures, but they speak to and have connections to the Golden Age style as we've been studying it thus far. It's worth noting that each of the texts we're reading this week were originally written in another language, in their own language. So we are reading translations. That's something to consider as we think about the language involved, that we are getting it through that kind of filter of translation. But each of them still can speak to us quite a bit about the culture and time period from which they came. So let's start with Russia. Crime fiction has a long heritage in Russia. A prominent example of that is Dostoevsky, who wrote Crime and Punishment from 1865 to 66, and The Brothers Karamazov in 1880. Both of these giants of Russian literature involved crimes as major plot points in them. But they don't focus on the detection and investigation in the same way that we have been looking at thus far. So detective fiction, as we have been thinking of it, what the Russians call detektivy, that's detective, the history of that is pretty short due to political factors. We know the Golden Age stories are marked as beginning with World War I, which we see as, that's 1918. That's roughly the beginning of Golden Age. And that time period marked major changes in Russia. The Russians, under a czarist rule, a monarchy, weren't doing well in World War I. They were suffering significant losses, which led to a lot of disillusionment and discontent among the Russian army. And so that led to the organizing of Soviet rebels who acted in the revolutions of 1917. They pulled out of World War I in March 1918, by the way. That's months before the war ended for the rest of us. So if you think about up to that point of the Golden Age beginning, they were already just so mired in a lot of, revolution, rebellion, a lot of upheaval in Russia. And they pulled out of the war a bit early. So the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was established in 1922. Stalin came to power in about the mid-20s. If you're aware of Stalin, we don't have the time to cover all of that, but that's the beginning of the USSR. USSR was built around a centralized government and economy. The idea that all of these socialist republics were centralized to one government and one economy. They were built on the idea of all people being equal, which meant a rejection of the rule of law as it had been up until then and many of the human rights values that we were seeing in other countries, focusing more on kind of flattening out the social class so that everyone is seen as the same, which also means we move away from the idea that anyone based on certain circumstances would be different and have a different situation than anybody else. These factors led to some common practices, such as censorship. The government was so centralized that it also had control over what was being put out artistically and what was being put out, kind of as news, journalism. That was all censored. Also led to an unofficial practice of the elimination of rivals. A lot of secrecy of people going kind of unofficially around the powers that be, or the powers that be doing this, going around kind of typical process to maintain that centralized control. Anyone who was coming against that centralized control was put down. And that means a lot of a presence of a secret police. Now, the secret police attached to the centralized government, they were largely seen as corrupt. They had little, if any, accountability for their actions. So they were the source of great fear and danger for Russians. That kind of the distrust for the secret police, and therefore a distrust and fear of authority in general, combined with the censorship, led to a dark time for Russian literature as a whole, but particularly resulted in far less development in the detective genre. So you really don't see much development in the Russian detective genre until the late 1960s and 1970s, after Stalin died. There is, however, a notable form of Russian detective literature in the first half of the 20th century, and that was known as the Pinkerton phenomenon. It's named so because the detectives were influenced by, in the stories, were influenced by a real-life Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which was established in 1850 in the United States. That was a famous, known detective agency across the world. Pinkerton agents were private detectives, security guards, undercover agents. They were called crisis managers, brought in to, handle crises, which is a vague term, meaning they did a lot of work, different kind of work. But in Russia, this kind of style of the private detective, the undercover agent, they were working to fix problems created by capitalists and the West. So the Pinkerton phenomenon in Russia was an anti-capitalist organization. It was something where these types of writings were seen as fighting the capitalists, who were always the bad guys. But even these stories that fit very much into the sensibilities of the USSR, very much into the idea that capitalism in itself was evil, they still were very much censored by the government. And so they had periods of the Pinkerton stories playing out, having kind of some popularity, but then they were also censored and eventually disappeared altogether because of that strong hand of control. So the Russian literature we're looking at this week comes from Anton Chekhov. Because of this limited history of detective fiction in the 20th century in Russia, we're going a bit before the official beginning of the Golden Age to look at this playwright and short story master. Chekhov lived from 1860 to 1904. He was born in southwest Russia, and he worked as a doctor throughout his literary career. He started writing to make money for his family, which was quite poor in Moscow after his father's grocery business failed. They were merchants. That business failed, and then it was a big family, and they worked to support the family. And so he was primarily a doctor. His early work is seen as less developed. He was often kind of amateurish in style. But he did get some encouragement from other writers and modest success from those less developed, less elevated pieces. So he started to publish more serious work in the 1880s. His work is largely characterized by its realism, which means it's focusing on the trivial and inconsequential details of daily life. This is supposed to be seen as slice of life kind of things. We're actually moving about a world that was day to day, very similar to what the world was like in real life. He had a tendency towards isolated and lonely characters, people who spent a lot of time within their own minds, thinking about things, grappling with serious questions. Chekhov's work was largely less plot-driven and more focused on character and mood. We were going deep with those isolated, lonely characters. And because of that, we had sometimes an isolated or lonely kind of mood to the pieces. However, he did tie some humor into that. Chekhov was a funny guy. And so there was some elements of humor that played into kind of the depressing explorations of the characters' situations. And those situations were often quite hopeless. The hopelessness of their situation kind of led to that overall mood, that tone that was dark or depressing. He wrote in more of a concise prose, which meant not a lot of the flowery literary devices we might be used to analyzing in a literature class, metaphor, symbolism, far less of that, and far more concise, clear prose that meant what it meant. The stories also often lack a clear or resolved ending, unlike our tidy endings with our British detective golden age stories. Chekhov leaned much more into unresolved endings, things that weren't as clear and concise. In his plays especially, he formalized a standard of that all narrative elements need to play a role in the story, a concept that is known as Chekhov's gun. It was built, again, around plays. The idea that if a gun appears in the first act of a play, it must go off by the third act. And that concept is that all narrative elements that are presented at the beginning of a piece need to play some role in how the story unfolds and ends. So we don't want something big and loud to happen at the beginning that has nothing to do, that kind of just disappears by the end of the story and doesn't actually play a role in the plot or the characters. And that idea of Chekhov's gun has become a standard in narrative development across cultures since him, and across genres too. That's not just detective fiction or even mostly detective fiction. That's all kind of narrative since then. The story we're looking at this week is called The Swedish Match. It was published in 1883. So again, quite a bit before the Golden Age, but circling around it. It is actually a parody of the type of deductive reasoning that was so prized by people like Sherlock Holmes stories, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Edgar Allan Poe, who we read about before, who was kind of the beginning of detective fiction. So he's parodying those in The Swedish Match.